we do something really interesting with identity. Identity is complicated, and that's part of this problem because it's nested in the concept of Western civilization. The way we stick identity on people has everything to do with the identity we hold for ourselves. And usually when we say the West, we think of Athens and Rome and England and maybe even Germany and France, reluctantly Spain. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. The steam engine was made by a guy named Heron. Heron was in the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. We've had the steam engine for 2,000 years now. Now, when I mentioned Heron, I didn't say it. I almost said it, but I caught myself. I almost said he was a Greek from Alexandria, Egypt, at the Great Library who invented the steam engine. And the reason I caught myself is because of the identity thing. When the Greeks conquered Egypt, 300 years before Heron's birth, the Greeks definitely separated themselves out from the Egyptians because they saw the Egyptians as inferior. But after 15 generations, there was no way Heron wasn't part Egyptian. In other words, calling Heron the Greek scientist from Egypt is really an interesting proposition because how Greek was he? How Egyptian was he? After 15 generations in Egypt, how Greek were the Greeks? If nothing else, their culture was modified by the Egyptians they lived around. Their DNA was modified because you know they were marrying into them. Not Cleopatra. But when I said Cleopatra, you went, oh, the Egyptian pharaoh, the woman. Cleopatra, by the way, it's the 7th. I'm keeping track. I know y'all mostly aren't. Cleopatra the 7th is the famous one. Cleopatra the 7th, that you identify as Egyptian, was 0% Egyptian. Her family tree is wonky and difficult because on 2 occasions she had an uncle marry a niece. So I don't know how to do this because I can't count the generations back because what am I supposed to do with the niece-uncle thing? Twice. If you go back 5 generations, the way to do this, the math on this, you take 2 to the power of the generation you're trying to go to. Your parents are 1 generation away from you, 2 to the first power is 2. Your grandparents are 2 away from you, so 2 squared is 4. Your great-grandparents are 2 cubed, that's 8. By the time you go 5 generations back, so 3 greats and then grandparents, you end up with 32 ancestors. You should have 32 great-great-great-grandparents. She had 4. A Persian and 3 Greeks. It's actually worse if you go 1 generation forward, you go to the 4th generation, she only had 2. But notice what we do. We go Cleopatra the Egyptian, Heron the Greek. Heron was definitely very Egyptian by the time we got to the 1st century AD. Cleopatra was definitely very not Egyptian at all in any way, shape, or form because she had been so secluded from Egyptian culture because the Greeks looked down on the Egyptians so intensely that they went out of their way to inbreed to try to prevent Egyptian DNA from entering the royal family. It's intense. Here, let me give you another example of what I mean by this. The guy who invented philosophy. Some people call him Thales. Americans usually say Thales. Thales, the Greek philosopher who invented philosophy, wasn't Greek. He wasn't Greek. Isn't that cool? He lived in a Greek city. The city was called Miletus. Miletus is today in Turkey. He spoke Greek, but he also spoke Phoenician because his family was from Lebanon. They were Phoenicians. They had moved to Miletus for business purposes. He grew up in Miletus and then produced the world's first ever work of philosophy, a book titled Water is Best. A Phoenician invented philosophy in a Greek city in what is today Turkey. But when we think of Thales, we think of a Greek. When we think of Heron, we think of a Greek. When we think of Cleopatra, we think of an Egyptian. That's what I mean. What we do is we have this tendency to be selective with how we apply the identities. And that gets all sorts of messy.